And what if the reason you enjoy being alone so much isn't a problem at all? What if it were a sign of something that very few people ever come to understand about themselves? Think about this for a moment. There are people who cannot stand being alone. They need noise. They need messages. They need constant company. They need to feel like something is always happening. And then there is you. You who often prefer silence. You who decline invitations without feeling immediate guilt. You who discovered that a few hours of solitude can give you more peace than an entire night surrounded by people. But here arises an uncomfortable question. Why? Why is something that is unbearable for so many feel like a refuge to you? Perhaps you have asked yourself this before. Perhaps you even started to think there was something clear's throat strange about you, because one day you noticed it. The need to be around everyone started to disappear. Conversations stopped exciting you. Gatherings began to feel long, heavy, empty. People who once held an important place in your life simply stopped sparking your interest. And the strangest part didn't happen after a fight. There was no betrayal. There was no great conflict. Just a slow, silent, almost imperceptible drifting away, as if something inside you had begun to quietly withdraw. Then came the guilt, that voice that whispers when no one else is listening. What is wrong with me? Am I becoming cold? Am I losing my ability to connect with others? And the more you asked yourself these questions, the more confused you felt. Because deep down, you knew something. You weren't suffering from being alone. You were suffering because you didn't understand why being alone made you feel so incredibly good. Carl Jung observed something fascinating about this phenomenon, something that remains just as true a century later. Sometimes loneliness doesn't appear because you reject people. Sometimes it appears because your mind no longer finds nourishment in certain places, because there comes a point where some conversations stop feeding you. You keep listening. You keep smiling. You keep responding. But something inside you is no longer there. Your body remains, but your attention doesn't. Your gaze drifts. Your energy begins to drain. No one notices. From the outside, you seem normal. From the inside, you feel further and further away. Perhaps you have lived this. You are sitting at a gathering, listening to people talk for minutes. Stories, rumors, repeated opinions, details that lead absolutely nowhere. And while everyone else seems to be enjoying it, you start to feel a tiredness that is hard to explain. It's not boredom, it's something deeper, as if a part of your mind is constantly working without finding anything actually worth holding on to. Then something curious happens. You go home, close the door, sit in silence, and for the first time in hours, you feel relief, as if you had just taken an invisible weight off your shoulders. Most people interpret this the wrong way. They think it's arrogance. They think it's superiority. They think you believe you are different. But the reality can be much simpler, much more human. There are minds that need depth to feel alive. Minds that search for meaning even when no one else is looking. Minds incapable of staying on the surface for too long. And when those minds spend hours navigating empty conversations, they end up exhausted. Not because they are better, but because they are looking for something different. Something that rarely appears in a crowd. Something that almost always appears somewhere else. In a slow, honest conversation, without masks, without rush, maybe with just one person, maybe in the middle of the night, maybe in that strange instant when two human beings stop talking to impress and start talking to understand. But this is where everything gets much more interesting, because this exhaustion isn't the real reason for your solitude. It is barely the first layer. Beneath it exists something much deeper, something that starts to reveal itself when you discover that many people listen to you, but very few truly understand you. When that happens, loneliness changes shape. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like distance. An invisible distance between your inner world and the world of others. And that is the next truth we are going to explore. There is something even stranger than being alone. Feeling like no one can really enter your world. You can be surrounded by people. You can have dozens of contacts in your phone. You can sit at a clear's throat table full of voices, and yet still feel a distance that no one else seems to notice. Because you don't always need more people. Sometimes you just need to feel understood. And that difference changes everything. Maybe that's why you so often ended up playing the same role. The one who listens, the one who understands, the one who advises, the one who stays when others fall apart. Your phone rings late at night. Someone needs to talk. You answer. You listen for half an hour, sometimes more. The other person ends the conversation much calmer. Thank you for being here. What would I do without you? And you smile. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. You hang up. Then silence. The room goes quiet again, and a question appears that no one asks you. And how are you? No one asks. And perhaps the most painful part is that you've gotten used to it. You became the safe space for others, but you never built a place where you could rest. People know they can come to you. They know you will listen, that you will understand, that you won't judge. But how many people truly know what goes on inside of you? That is a different question, because listening to someone doesn't necessarily mean being heard. Understanding others doesn't mean being understood. And there can be a very silent asymmetry in your relationships. You enter into the emotional world of others with ease. You notice the fear behind their words, the sadness hidden behind a smile, the anger disguised as indifference. You notice what they don't say. But when it's your turn, something changes. Perhaps once you tried to open up, you started to tell something that really mattered to you. You waited. You thought that maybe, finally, someone was going to enter that part of you, and the response was superficial. Yeah, I get it. Then they changed the subject, or started talking about themselves. And you noticed. You didn't make a scene. You didn't complain. You simply closed a door. And since then, it became easier to listen than to talk, easier to understand than to be understood, easier to be available for others than to allow someone to be truly available for you. Here appears a very particular kind of loneliness. It is not the loneliness of someone who has no people. It is the loneliness of someone who has people but has no true intimacy. And over time, you can start to confuse one with the other. You think, clears throat. If they look for me, then we are close. But maybe not. Maybe you are just necessary. Being needed does not always mean being loved. There is a huge difference between the two. When someone only seeks you out when they need something, there is contact, but not necessarily a bond. And if you occupy that role for years, you can end up believing that this is your way of relating, giving, solving, listening, holding, but never showing too much of yourself. Because maybe, without realizing it, you learned that your value was precisely there, in being useful, in being strong, in not needing anything. And then something dangerous happens. Your identity begins to be built around a version of you that always has something to offer, but never has permission to need anything. And maybe that's why solitude ends up seeming more comfortable to you. Because when you are alone, no one expects anything from you. You don't have to be a therapist. You don't have to give advice. You don't have to interpret anyone's emotions. You don't have to keep a conversation going. You can simply exist without a function, without a mask, without having to prove that you are strong. And there arises another question. Who are you when you are not emotionally taking care of anyone? Because maybe you don't fully know that person yet. And here begins one of the deepest parts of this process, the tendency to make yourself small. Not physically, psychologically. You do it when you have a complex idea but decide not to say it. When you have a different opinion but soften it. When you want to talk about something you are truly passionate about, but you stop yourself because you imagine the other person's reaction. It's too much. They're going to think I'm exaggerating. They won't understand. And so you change the words. You simplify them. You make them smaller until what comes out of your mouth no longer exactly represents what was inside your head. The other person smiles, nods. The conversation continues, and apparently everything is fine. But you know something is missing because you just hid a part of yourself. And when you do this over and over again for years, you start to lose the habit of showing yourself as you truly are. You adapt so much that the adaptation starts to look like personality. You tell yourself, I'm just quiet. I don't talk much. I prefer to listen. Maybe. But maybe you also learned that showing too much of yourself came with a price, and that difference deserves to be observed. Because being reserved can be part of your nature, but hiding out of fear is something else entirely. One thing is to choose silence. Another very different thing is to feel you don't have permission to speak. And when you start to distinguish between the two, something inside you begins to wake up, because maybe you aren't tired of people. Maybe you are tired of the version of yourself you have to play when you are with them. And then solitude offers you something. Once again, a space where you don't need to shrink, where you can think to the end, talk to yourself, read, create. Ask yourself questions that no one else is asking. And for a few hours, you can occupy the entire space of your own mind. But be careful, because this is where a very fine line appears. Solitude can return you to yourself, but it can also become an excuse to never get close to anyone again. And that difference can completely change the meaning of your isolation. Because maybe up until now, you thought being alone meant freedom. But what if a part of that freedom was also fear? That question is much harder, and it is precisely there that the next part of this journey begins. And here appears a truth that can be uncomfortable. Maybe it wasn't others who made you feel small. Maybe it was you who learned to shrink in order to stay. Think about it. You are about to say something. An idea you've been building in your head for several minutes. You open your mouth and stop because you already know the reaction. A confused look, an awkward smile, a change of subject. So you simplify. You take out a part, then another, until what you finally say barely resembles what you really wanted to express. The conversation continues. No one notices anything except you. You know exactly what you just did. You made yourself small. And you've probably been doing it for a long time. At family gatherings, with coworkers, with neighbors, even with people you love. Not because you are fake, but because you learned to protect the bond before protecting your own authenticity. Maybe you called it kindness. Maybe you called it humility. Maybe you thought, it's not worth explaining. But there are moments when adapting stops being a virtue and starts to become a silent way of disappearing. Because every time you hide an important part of yourself so that others are comfortable, something inside you learns that your truth is too much, too complex, too intense, too deep. And after repeating it for years, you don't even need anyone to ask you to be quiet anymore. You do it yourself before speaking, before showing yourself, before being seen. That is what is truly dangerous. When external censorship becomes an internal voice. And then solitude begins to feel like freedom. Because when you are alone, you don't have to translate yourself. You don't have to explain why you think the way you do. You don't have to measure every word. You don't have to turn a deep idea into a comfortable phrase. You can think to the end. You can feel without justifying yourself. You can occupy all the space in your own mind. And when you experience that freedom, going back to certain environments can feel almost unbearable. But we must stop here because there is a difference between protecting your authenticity and using your authenticity as an excuse to isolate yourself. A small difference, but a decisive one. The question is not, am I too deep for others? The question is, how many times have I chosen to stay silent to avoid making others uncomfortable? And also, how many times have I used my difference to avoid getting close? Because both things can exist at the same time. You can have a deep mind and still hide. You can need meaningful conversations and still be terrified of true intimacy. You can value your solitude and, at the same time, use it to avoid rejection. That is where psychology gets really interesting, because not everything that looks like independence is freedom. Sometimes it is a defense, and a defense can be so clever that it ends up looking like a life philosophy. I'm better off alone. People are too superficial. I don't need anyone. Perhaps a part of that is true, but what if another part of it was simply an elegant way to never feel disappointed again? That question hurts because it forces you to look beneath the story you have constructed about yourself, and maybe there you will find something older, a memory, an experience, a moment when you learned that showing too much of yourself could cost you something. Maybe you don't remember exactly when it happened. It doesn't matter. The body remembers in other ways, in the way you react, in what you avoid, in the people you keep at a distance. In the exact moment someone starts to get to know you too well, and something inside you wants to escape. And then another characteristic appears that usually accompanies this kind of loneliness. The questions. Questions you can't stop asking. Why do we do things this way? Why does everyone just accept this? Who decided this was the only way? Why does no one question it? Maybe you remember asking one of those clears throat questions when you were a child. Perhaps the atmosphere changed immediately. Silence. A strange look. A quick response. Because it's always been done that way. And you learned something without anyone having to explain it to you. There are questions that make people uncomfortable. There are ideas that disrupt a group's tranquility. And there are people who prefer to keep the peace rather than discover if that peace is built on a lie. Over time, maybe you stopped asking those questions out loud, but inside you they continued. Each one opened the distance a little wider between you and those around you. because while others found security in answers, you kept living inside the questions, and that can be exhausting. Not because asking questions is bad, but because constantly questioning what everyone takes for granted forces you to walk off the beaten path. Jung spoke of something related to this when he described the collective unconscious. People do not live solely by their own ideas. They also live within shared beliefs, customs, values, invisible rules, and ways of thinking that pass from one generation to the next. While everyone accepts those rules, the person who begins to question them can seem strange, even dangerous. Not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they force others to look at what they preferred not to see. The group usually protects its stability. That's why the person who asks an uncomfortable question often ends up feeling like an outsider. But here is something you must remember. You do not need to become an enemy of society in order to think for yourself. You do not need to reject everything. You do not need to believe that everyone is asleep and you are the only one who sees. That too can become just another ego, another mask, another way of feeling superior. True individuation does not consist of saying, everyone is wrong. It consists of asking yourself, what is truly mine? Which beliefs did I consciously choose? And which ones did I simply inherit? Which relationships do I actually desire? And which ones do I maintain out of fear? Which parts of me are authentic, and which were built to receive approval? That search can be lonely, but it can also be profoundly liberating. Then comes another problem: speed. Your mind can reach a conclusion before the other person has even finished formulating their question. You already saw the pattern. You already imagined the consequences. You already thought of 3 possible responses. And now you have to wait. Smile. Listen. Let the other person slowly arrive at a place you reached several minutes ago. It might look like patience, but sometimes it is just exhaustion. And if this happens constantly, you can start to disconnect. Not because you despise the other person, but because it is exhausting to remain in a conversation where you feel you have to continuously hit the brakes on your own thought process. But there is also a lesson here. Human relationships are not a race. It is not always about who arrives at a conclusion first. Sometimes it is about walking together, about allowing the other person to arrive at their own pace, about listening not just to the conclusion, but to the path that led to it. Because a deep relationship doesn't need 2 people thinking at the exact same speed. It needs 2 people willing to meet each other. Maybe that is one of the things you still need to learn. You don't have to shrink your mind to connect with someone, but you also don't need to demand that someone think exactly like you. You can maintain your depth without turning it into a wall. You can think fast and still learn to wait. You can love your solitude without turning it into a place no one can return from with you. Because, in the end, the true question is not how much time you can spend alone. The true question is, can you remain yourself when someone gets close? And that question leads us directly to the next level of this story. And here we arrive at an even more delicate part. Because maybe you have learned to be alone. Maybe you have even learned to enjoy it. But what happens when someone really tries to get close? That is where many people discover that their solitude isn't always a choice. Sometimes it is a defense. A defense so well constructed that for years it can look like independence. You meet someone. The conversation starts well. There is interest, curiosity, even a certain connection. And for a while, everything seems natural. But then a moment arrives. The other person starts asking more personal questions. They want to know you. Not the polite version. Not the version that listens. Not the version that gives advice. You. And something inside you changes. You start to feel uncomfortable. You pull away a little. You respond less. You find reasons not to meet up. And finally, the connection cools down. From the outside, it looks like you simply lost interest. But maybe something else happened. Maybe the closeness activated something that the distance kept asleep. Because being alone has one huge advantage. No one can enter the parts of you that you don't yet know how to show. No one can reject them. No one can misinterpret them. No one can use them against you. Above all, no one can abandon you after having seen them. That last point is important, because sometimes we don't fear loneliness as much as we fear losing someone after allowing them in. That's why some people keep relationships at a certain distance. Close enough to feel a connection, but not so close as to feel vulnerable. It's a kind of invisible equilibrium. Stay close, but not too close. Get to know me, but not completely. Listen to me, but don't try to go too deep. And as long as no one crosses that line, everything seems under control. But real intimacy doesn't work like that. Intimacy demands risk. It demands allowing someone to see parts of you that you cannot control. And there appears one of the hardest questions in this entire process. What are you really protecting? Your peace or your wound? Because they are not always the same thing. Maybe you have called peace the absence of risk. But a life without emotional risk can also become a life without true closeness. Jung understood that psychological growth does not simply consist of eliminating what makes us uncomfortable. It consists of making it conscious, looking at it, understanding it, integrating it. That is part of the process of individuation. Not becoming someone completely independent of others, but becoming someone who can be with themselves without losing the ability to encounter others. Because there is a huge difference between needing someone and choosing someone. When you desperately need company, you can accept almost any bond. Any attention seems enough. Any message seems important. Anyone who stays seems valuable. But when you learn to be with yourself, something changes. You no longer choose from a place of fear. You can observe. You can wait. You can say, "This isn't good for me," and walk away without drama, without resentment, without needing to convince anyone. But there is also a trap here. You can take your standards too far. You can turn the search for depth into an impossible search for perfection. This person doesn't completely understand me. This conversation isn't deep enough. These people don't think like I do. And so you discard a relationship before giving it time to grow. Because not all deep bonds start out deep. Some begin with something simple, a normal conversation, a small coincidence, a laugh, a question. And little by little, if there is trust, depth appears. You don't need someone to immediately reach the bottom of your soul. You need to know if they are willing to walk there with you. That is different. And maybe that is one of the lessons solitude is trying to teach you. You don't need a lot of people, but you don't need to close every door either. You need to learn which doors deserve to remain open. Because if you close them all, no one can hurt you, but no one can find you either. And here appears an even more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we say, "I'm alone because no one understands me." But maybe we should also ask ourselves, how many opportunities have I given someone to truly know me? Because if you never show what is behind the mask, you cannot blame the world for not seeing your true face. Maybe you have spent years waiting for someone to understand you, without realizing that understanding you requires you to show yourself first. Not completely, not all at once, but honestly. One small truth after another, and observing what the other does with it. Do they protect it? Do they respect it? Do they use it? Do they ignore it? That is where true discernment begins. It is not about opening up to everyone. It is about learning to recognize who you can open up to. And this changes the entire meaning of being alone. Because maybe your goal isn't to stop being alone. Maybe it is to stop feeling obligated to be. There is a huge difference. You can continue enjoying your quiet afternoons, your books, your thoughts, your silence. But when someone appears who is capable of finding you without demanding that you become someone else, you won't have to run. You won't have to hide. And that is maturity, not needing everyone, not rejecting everyone, knowing how to choose, knowing how to get close, knowing how to step away, knowing, above all, when distance protects you and when it simply keeps you trapped. Because maybe true freedom does not consist of saying, "I don't need anyone." Maybe it consists of being able to say, "I can be alone, but I can also let you in." And when you reach that point, your solitude stops being a fortress built against the world. It becomes an interior space from which you can return to the world without losing yourself in it. And there, the story changes completely. Because you are no longer looking for people to fill a void. You are looking for people with whom to share a life that already has meaning. And that difference can change the way you choose every single person who enters your life. And maybe now you should ask yourself something even deeper. How many people have I kept out of my life because they didn't meet my standards? Maybe some really were superficial, but maybe others just needed time. Not every deep connection begins with a deep conversation. Sometimes it starts with something small, a question, a laugh,